And now, Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for Deborah Kobylt Live. And please join me in welcoming our guest, Jamie Mittleman, the host of the Flame Broiler. Oh, my goodness. Wait a minute. The Flame, help me out, Flame Bearers podcast. Could you imagine? I mean, where is my mind right now? It's lunchtime and I'm thinking Flame Broiler. Oh, my goodness. The Flame Bearers podcast. That's a great one. I'm leaving that in. It's a pleasure to have you here. You are also a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy, and you're an all-around women's advocate and athlete. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Talk to us, first of all. What is your podcast about?
Sure. So the Flame Bearers podcast is a professionally researched and produced podcast that champions the women Olympians and Paralympians who are competing in Tokyo this summer. So we share their rarely heard stories and talk about the issues that are most important to them.
Right. And where did you get the idea to do this? Because you said you started your podcast about a year ago. You're also a grad student. You're a busy lady. So what got you started on this?
Sure. If I'm being totally honest, I actually kind of started as my own personal rescue mission. So the last 4 years have been really hard on my family. We lost my dad's brain cancer. We almost lost my mom, and we've been really struggling to readjust. And I think that I realized that my world had been really dark until COVID hit. And I realized that I had adapted all these coping mechanisms that I wanted to share with other people. And I created this podcast to really be a microphone for women who are real masters of resiliency that we can all learn from. So my hope is that by sharing these examples of women who've gone through so much, we can make this really tough time slightly more bearable for everyone.
Tell me a little bit about Paralympics. What is that? Because it's very different than, of course, Special Olympics. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's the Olympics and then there's the Paralympics. So the Olympics are for able-bodied athletes, and then the Paralympics are for physically disabled athletes. So these are athletes maybe who were born without an arm, were born without a leg, were hit by a car and lost one of those limbs. Maybe they are partially blind, so they have physical limitations. This is actually the first year that NBC is showing the Paralympics on prime time. So I'm really excited to be a part of giving them the athletes the coverage they deserve.
Now, you started this again as a grad student, and didn't you sort of partner with the Harvard Kennedy School for this podcast? Because it's such an extraordinary idea, not just to highlight the female athletes, and we're going to get into that in a minute, but the Paralympic athletes. They've got such stories of courage and determination. It's incredible. That's why I'm going to really encourage people to listen to your podcast. It really inspires all of us to get out and do something, right?
Thank you. And don't get me started. Honestly, within the US, 3.2% of all sports media coverage goes to women athletes, and pretty much 100% of that goes to able-bodied athletes. So what's left are the scraps that kind of goes to these Paralympians who've gone through so many trials and tribulations. And for those of us who are stuck at home alone in isolation during COVID, if you want to hear from people who've gone through serious ups and downs, I feel like they're the best role models that you can look to.
Yeah. How do you pick your guests? Because you've got such a variety of lovely, interesting, intelligent guests. How do you do that? It's all you, isn't it?
No, well, thank you. That's a huge honor. I'm a part of, I have two teammates who are doing a fantastic job of helping me kind of select the athletes, but it's a number of different factors. So first of all, they all have to be women identifying athletes. So they have to be competing in Tokyo or had been trying to compete in Tokyo. We actually featured 2 women who did not end up making the games. We also try to feature athletes in a variety of sports. So gymnastics, soccer, basketball, but also the lesser known sports like badminton or javelin, for example. We also try to feature athletes from a wide range of socioeconomic classes, races, religions, countries. We featured one athlete from every continent minus Antarctica because they don't send athletes to the games. So we try to capture the full experience of what does it mean to go to the Olympics and Paralympics, and how could those experiences be different for people around the world?
We spoke about coverage for female athletes, and very often, and this is so true, especially in years past, they would talk about female athletes, how they get along with the other athletes, are they fighting, which is so ridiculous. That's starting to, those barriers are starting to break down now, aren't they? I mean, now more we're talking about the athleticism and the story behind their hard work, right?
Completely. And I think that is just as important as kind of the lack of coverage. There's also the issue of how the athletes are covered. And if the people who they're talking about actually like how they're being depicted, or if it makes their skin crawl. So one of the things that I love about working on this podcast is I'm an independent person who I view these athletes as my boss. So I'm not reporting to an editor or a journal that says, oh, this is the story, this is the narrative you have to create. I go to them and I say, I want to produce the best piece on you that has ever existed. How can I help you get your story out there? So I think from their perspective, they're like, yes, great. Like we have a champion.
Isn't that though the best part about podcasting? You don't have a boss. You're your own boss. And I also do that, right? I did it with you. I say, what do you want to make sure that our audience hears? Because guess what? You know about yourself and your podcast way better than I ever will. And those athletes know way more about themselves than you ever will. So instead of some producer who never even meets these people, right? We're deciding along with our guest, what's the best story to tell, which I think is very rich. And if people tune into your podcast, the Flame Bearers podcast, that's what they'll hear. A lot of heart from these people. Give me one or two that have really resonated with you, please.
Oh gosh, I feel like you're making me pick
I know
my children right now. Okay, I'm gonna throw Zara Namati. So Zara is a Iranian. She's probably the most well-known female athlete in Iran. She's the first female gold medalist from Iran. She competed in both the Olympics and the Paralympics. She was a very serious Taekwondo competitor. She was in a car accident that paralyzed her from the waist down, and archery was part of her rehabilitation process. She ended up winning gold, and her story was all about finding hope in a time where she was completely hopeless. What was also really cool was we produced this around the 1-year anniversary of General Soleimani's death. So Iran and the US were not getting along. So it was a really cool example of using the power of sport to bring people together. And I feel like Zara is just such an incredible role model for that.
Isn't that also the purpose of the Olympics, or at least it's supposed to be, right? It hasn't always been that way. We know that with boycotts and everything else in years past. But isn't that what it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to unify all of us. I love that story. Go ahead. You were going to say something else.
Two others, then I know you said two. One of the first episodes I did was with Becky Sauerbrunn, who is the captain of the U.S. women's soccer team. So probably the biggest women's sports team in the world right now. Becky, I think, is one of the most amazing leaders that I have ever seen. She is quiet and soft-spoken, but she leads with her heart and she leads with actions. And her episode is all about the current pay equity lawsuit that her team is undergoing. And what I really loved about working with Becky is that she's the type of person who will not champion herself, but I think because she's a little quieter is often overlooked. But to me, when I take a step back and I look at the success of the U.S. women's soccer team, she has been so instrumental and kind of behind the scenes of so many of the big moves and plays that the team has made. So that was a real honor to work with her.
Did you say you had another one?
Yes, one more. I'm going to say Ezinne Kalu of Nigeria. So she is the MVP of the Nigerian basketball team, and she's also an entrepreneur. So she was sick and tired of always being called the basketball player. So she actually launched her own cosmetics company. And what I loved about Ezinne is, here's someone who's at the top of her game, who's going to the Olympics, and she's sick and tired of being put in a box. And she says, screw that. I'm going to come up with something that people can now understand is a big part of me too. So she's been very successful with her cosmetics company, Kalu Cosmetics. And I just think it's a great example of showing the multidimensionality of people, that they're not just athletes, they're human beings with aspirations outside of sport, just like anyone else.
You were an athlete as a young kid, right? Or still are, really, right? What did you play?
I was. It sounds so silly even saying that in the context of these athletes. I played soccer, I ski raced, and I ran track. But it's very humbling to talk to these people. I feel like clinging to any form of athleticism as my identity just makes me look silly.
No, I know what you mean, because I've interviewed Olympic skaters, right? And I was a skater, and of course that was my aspiration. I didn't get there, but and when I tell them, it's like, I was a competitive skater, and then I sort of stopped there. I'm like, but I didn't quite get to your level. I know you feel like ho hum, but an athlete's an athlete, right? You work hard, you get up early, and you're practicing, and those are goals, or rather, those are that stays with you for the rest of your life, right? That determination and that hard work, no matter what you do later in your life, that stays with you, right?
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think that sports teach you things that you can't learn in a classroom.
Yeah.
On one of our recent episodes, the father of Eliza Stone, who's the #1 fencer in the world, he said,
Wow.
sports teach you something, in the US, excuse me, sports teach you what math tests and science tests can't teach you. They teach you how to get up when you've been pushed on the ground. And I think he nailed it. I think that's spot on.
Yeah, he certainly did. So, tell me about how you partnered, right? They supported, right? The Harvard Kennedy School. They've actually helped support this podcast, right?
Absolutely. So really grateful for the support of the Harvard Kennedy School and specifically their Women in Public Policy program. So essentially, I received a grant from them last year to provide the funding to actually get this podcast up and off the ground. They've financially supported me throughout this entire past year. I've also been a part of what's called the Harvard Innovation Lab, which is basically a startup incubator for any student across the entire Harvard ecosystem who has an idea and wants to make it a reality. So through that program, I've had access to workshops, mentorship. I can't say enough about my mentor, Dino Catania, who literally meets with me every week just to talk about whatever it is on my mind, funding opportunities. So essentially, you go to them with an idea and they say, we want to help you make your dreams happen. So it's very cool. Honored to be a part of it.
How do you think we can see the coverage of female athletes change this year on the networks and on cable stations? Because I would like to see them get more in depth with these athletes and as female athletes, but not just about how they're getting along with their teammates,
Totally. I think it's a couple different things. Number one, I want coverage to go up. I want the quality of coverage to go up in terms of what are they talking about. So, and then I also think who is covering them should change. So I think there's a whole new class of aspiring women sports journalists like Heidi, who is our modern pentathlete from Egypt. Her career goal after the Olympics is to become a sports journalist. So there's a whole group of women who are dying to cover the Olympics and Paralympics. They just haven't done so yet. I think a couple other things, I would say humanizing the athletes. So not necessarily putting them up on a complete pedestal, but also showing them as well-rounded people who, eat, breathe, do other things when they are not competing, I think would be appreciated too.
Even though I was in school over 20 years ago in college, right? And I really wanted to cover sports. And they looked at me like I grew a third eye in my forehead. They're like, why? Because even then, a lot of female athletes weren't covered. So I really feel like we've come a long way. I mean, it's actually something I still want to do, because every time I look at an athlete, by the way, male or female, I want to know their backstory, because they all have one. How did they train? Because we all know how tough it is to train. I'm sure they've been injured. They've had all kinds of issues, probably personally. How do they get through that? I think that's one of the most compelling, really, parts of watching sports, in particular the Olympics, because they've been doing more and more of that. And I love that you're putting a spotlight on our female athletes, and in particular the Paralympics. I just think this is fantastic. So now you're trying to get over there this year, right? You're trying to get over to the Olympics. Let's talk about that. Who needs to hear this? Because believe me, I'm going to give a shout out. I'm going to tag them on my social media. So let's talk about this.
So essentially, I'm trying to go on the ground in Tokyo. I have all costs already covered through grants. I have interviews lined up if I'm able to be there in person. I just need a media credential to get in the door. I know that they are being very restrictive and careful, and rightly so, with passes given the pandemic. Essentially, I just need to be able to enter the sporting arenas.
Can Harvard help you at all? One of the athletes that you've covered, perhaps they need somebody to go over there with them. I mean, what avenues have you tried? Hello, NBC.
Yeah. I've tried pretty much everything via the Harvard route. I'm just going to mention the like very kosher things that I've done besides DMing people and everything. I've also tried working with national governing bodies, working as a student ambassador, things like that. I'm really hopeful to be able to go along with one of the smaller networks potentially to provide them with a unique angle, given the relationships I've built and given the focus of the podcast.
You know, even some of the cable stations like Spectrum is big now, right? Like really big now, covering sports now. I'm sure you've knocked on their door too, but you know, just anything that we can find to get you over there. And I said to you earlier before we started the podcast, I said, why do I have a feeling that I'm going to turn on the TV and I'm going to be like, there's Jamie, she made it there. Like, I just have a feeling, Jamie, while you may not have your credential right now, you're going to get it. You're going to get it because you tell a compelling story that a lot of people are not telling. They're just not telling these stories. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. I do think that there is a huge opportunity, you know, and one of the main goals of this podcast is to provide hope during this really terrible, challenging time. And I think a lot of that will exist on the ground. And I don't think that the big outlets necessarily cover it from that angle. I think all these athletes have gone through so many ups and downs this past year in particular, and their families aren't there, their friends aren't there. No one is there for them to be able to intimately talk about that with. And I think it's a huge miss, not only for the athlete, but also just the general population.
Yeah. And you're a true advocate for women in all areas, right? But I called you, in a way, you're like a female activist, right? You really are. I mean, you're a champion for all of us. What do you hope to do in years to come? You know, after this year's Olympics, you are studying public policy. Do you think you're going to continue in this area, you know, fighting for women? Again, you're an athlete, but working with female athletes, because I really just think it's a very interesting lane that you've chosen.
100%. I'm not going anywhere. So, you know, looking back, my career started, I lived in Bangladesh. I worked at the first liberal arts school for girls in Asia. I was a gender studies minor in college. I've always been really passionate about working with women and girls, ideally in media where you can impact and shape how people think. I think that media is often overlooked as a potential form of advocacy, but I think it is one of the most powerful ways that you can change and kind of get into people's homes and give them a friendly nudge and say, hey, maybe you should reconsider that.
Yep. And I know you're going to be doing that. Anything else you'd like to tell our audience before we let you go, please?
I'm just so grateful for the opportunity. I think what you're doing is absolutely amazing. And if there's any way that people can check out some of the athletes I've worked with, they're the real heroes here. They're the masters of resiliency who've overcome so much, literally have spent their entire lives working up to this moment. And hopefully it happens. If we're having a challenging day, a challenging time, listen to their stories. It makes me feel better every time when I feel down in the dumps. And, you know, it's a great pick me up. So I'm hoping I can kind of continue to tell their stories and honor them in the best way possible.
There's many stories to tell. You could probably continue for who knows how long, right? It's wonderful. I do hope that we see you at the Olympics, and let's try and make that happen. The Flame Bearers podcast. How many episodes, by the way, have you done?
Up to 18. So we're up to 18 episodes in 38 countries and a total of 76 contributing experts. So in every episode, we bring on about 3 to 5 different contributing experts. They could be family members, academics, thought leaders, to talk about whatever it is that the athlete cares about.
Beautiful. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. Anything you'd like to add that I didn't ask you?
Nope, you nailed it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, let's, you know, everybody, please just tune in and reach out. If you have any ideas on how to get Jamie over to the Olympics, reach out to her on social media, right? What's your handle, by the way, especially Instagram? What's your handle?
Jamie Mittleman, Mittleman, really complicated.
Yeah, no, we got that. Okay, very good. And again, the Flame Bearers podcast, please look that up on all podcast platforms. We very much are excited that you joined us today, Jamie Mittleman, and continue with your studies and continue doing all that great work for all women, in particular, these female athletes. And thanks everybody for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live. I really enjoyed speaking with Jamie. And same, you could find our podcast everywhere in addition to YouTube. We're on Facebook. We're just sort of everywhere. Just look up our name, look up Jamie's name, and you'll find our podcast. Thanks so much.